hang on. Yeah, it looks like it's working. 1 second.
Now it says it's live on YouTube. I can see it on the top left of the screen.
Okay, yeah, it's live.
Cool.
All right. Great. So let me share my screen. Welcome everyone to the third session of our principal seminar. This one is on censorship resistance. I thought we'd do things slightly differently here in order to make sure that we sort of get as broad active participation as possible. So one of the things that we want out of these sessions is to have an updated wall of shame and ways we're falling short of censorship resistance. So I thought I shared a link to a HackMD file in the chat. And I thought if we could just like take a few minutes and sort of fill out ways that we think that we are falling short of this. And just take sort of a few minutes and think about it for yourself and try to fill out maybe three to five things that you can think of. And then after that, I'll sort of go through this. And then as you come up with, as I'm talking and as we have discussions, feel free to sort of add more stuff, but just so we have sort of start to engage on this like one by one. So in terms of sort of some tricks for how to come up with this, one way is sort of think about how censorship resistance interact with other principles that we have. And also like sort of maybe thinking more as sort of an enemy or adversary, how status can be censored. So yeah, jump into the document and let's just do that for a few minutes and then I'll go through the presentation. You can see it here. And in order to not sort of collide with each other, I think, yeah, just start somewhere like a bit further down so people don't write over each other.
I think that you can go ahead and start with your slides, Oscar. Well, this would be
just take a few minutes so people can focus on this thinking and then.
Idea generator 2 is really clear, but idea generator 1, it's not so clear for me what is meant there.
So it just, if it's not useful, you don't have to use it, but idea is essentially that you think of censorship resistance and maybe openness, and then maybe there's some interaction between them that makes it so that censorship resistance is harder or easier, or they are it's subtle in some way, or maybe there's some impact around security or privacy and these types of things.
So what do you mean by pairings, these pairings?
I just mean as a sort of way of thinking about it. So if you look at two principles together, like maybe they sort of point to the same types of problems or solutions, or maybe they are in conflict with each other, for example. Or maybe, yeah, with censorship and liberty, maybe that's sort of a connection that you can make that's positive and so on. But if it's not how you think naturally, you don't have to use it. It's just a way of thinking about it.
He's just talking about the two ones for today's seminar. So he's paired each of the seminar topics per day in a way to encourage some sort of discussion, is what he means by that.
All right, cool. So maybe I'll get started with the sort of talk, but I encourage everyone, because there's sort of more people we have individually think about this sort of high quality discussion we can have, and we can see sort of common points and so on. So if you think of something while I'm talking or during discussion, please fill in straight away in that HackMD. All right. So let me go back here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah,
all
cool.
Good.
So censorship resistance, we enable free flow of information, no content is under surveillance, and we abide by the cryptoeconomic design principle of censorship resistance. And even stronger than this, status is an agnostic platform for information. So what is censorship to begin with? One way to think about it is as kind of discriminatory treatment of information. And in Status case, you can think about it in several layers. So one is sort of in terms of transactions and censoring that. And other is in terms of censoring the network, either sort of whisper network or sort of internet in general and so on, but also on a sort of social level. So in terms of groups and who you can talk to and these types of things. And one of the goals here is to sort of make censorship costly. So maybe it's not impossible to censor someone, but it should be kind of costly to do so. And there's some examples of sort of traditional censorship that we've seen recently. So one is WikiLeaks had sort of financial blockade from most sort of payment providers and so on, and that forced them to adapt Bitcoin earlier than other people, other non-for-profits. There's also sort of internet outages during protests that sort of makes it so people can't coordinate in a productive way. And then there's complex example from WeChat and Facebook and YouTube and subreddits. And yeah, if you look, there's plenty of examples of this going on. So decentralized web, like largely, like this type of censorship resistance is largely sort of what Web3 enables. And this is really a huge competitive advantage and something that's unique about what we're working on and so on. And let's use this, because this is sort of one of the few things that are sort of unique about this space and sort of what all this technology and all this sort of slowness in terms of developing it enables. And making a bit of a connection to freedom of speech. This is a quote here by a friend of Voltaire that you probably heard about before, but just want to reiterate it. Like, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend it to death, your right to say it. In order to actually have freedom of speech, you need censorship resistance. It's sort of a prerequisite for that. Some of you might have been confused about sort of cryptoeconomic design that's stated in the principle. What it means is essentially that you use cryptography and economic incentives to raise the cost of censorship. And this mostly applies when it comes to things like transactions in Ethereum. And this is sort of a big debate or big question in terms of how to design Ethereum 2.0. But it's also sort of something that we can use to make our own network, or sort of the Whisper network more generally and so on, harder to censor. Thinking a bit more about sort of decentralization and these things, one aspect is this idea of single points of failure. And the way single points of failures work is that it's sort of a pressure point, right? Like you just need to poke a little bit and then sort of everything falls from there. And this is also related to coercion resistance, which is slightly different, but coercion resistance is more about poking at one individual that has a lot of power or say or so, and that sort of disproportionately influences what people do. So that's more on the individual side, where censorship might be more on sort of the information side. Examples of this are the fact that we rely on Infura and FSCAN and cluster and so on. You just need to poke a bit there, and then you sort of everything falls down. When we talk about an agnostic platform, I guess you can say, in terms of like we don't. There's two ways of, when it comes to like we don't know, like agnostic means we don't know, and I think you can apply it in two ways. So one is there's a lot of sort of ways people look at the world and ways of understanding the world that exist right now that might not exist in a few decades or longer from now. And it's sort of, there's something about like us humans saying it's like we don't know actually what sort of the right way of looking at this, and we need sort of diversity and people to be able to express and play around with these ideas. But then also in the other sense that we literally don't know what people are talking about, which is also an asset as a kind of weakness. We don't want to know what goes on everywhere in sort of inside of status necessarily. And it's not our role to decide. This is sort of a battle of ideas, and abiding by this quote I showed earlier. And just some thought here, like in the war between true and false, like the false lose by being false and not by being censored. And there's also this sort of thing called this Streisand effect, which is if you try to suppress information, it actually grows. And just something that I think would be useful to keep in mind. And yeah, so Wall of Shame, there's a document here, so please add stuff here. And with that, I would like to hand over to our facilitator, Michael. Thank you.
Hi. So I think I'd like to start at single points of failure. Does somebody want to jump in on our single points of failure?
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Yeah, I think that operational systems like Android, iOS, Debian, Mac OS, Windows, they also pose a type of single point of failure. And also another really important that is, I think, even more than these operational systems are the internet service providers that are a great way to censorship a whole network. So if you try to use status in North Korea, I'm not sure if it will actually work, because I don't know how are the roles there, how are their firewall set up. So maybe to connect any IP, you need to make a request to the government. That would be really kind of like a dictatorship network. So it's possible to do that if you point a gun to the ESP providers.
Okay.
How do you get around something like that?
We have to be concerned with somebody pointing a gun at us. Is that what you're trying to say?
I agree. That's what we are solving in the first level, but we have all these other levels that are also a point of failure. So yeah, we have some solutions for that will be actually something like a mesh network that computers directly connect by themselves instead of using a central institution that is the central computer, a central router. So you don't have that anymore. You can, especially when you look at big cities, you see a lot of Wi-Fi routers there, Wi-Fi signals. Imagine how those Wi-Fi signals could, instead of being isolated, being together communicating themselves. So I'll upgrade to this router firmware could make possible enable a mesh network with current hardware, depending on the situations. Maybe some more far away from the city, you will need like a pointing antenna to somewhere. So actually the problem from these mesh networks, I think it's not really fast. So that would be a problem.
We'll be looking into that in Prague. We have 2 mesh networking companies joining us at the hackathon. Corey, what did you want to add to the single points of failure?
First, I guess I can add on to what me and Ned talked about. Ned created a Discuss post about some mesh networking stuff and the possibility of being able to like on-ramp people directly from your phone. And then I commented on that in one of the Discuss threads. And I think that's a really cool potential thing to then implement, but it has to be done. It seems though as though at the pure connection level. I don't know if Adam's here or someone else in the P2P team, but I think that's where it has to be like, and it also points to something we came across yesterday, is like the status protocol versus status implementation and how things are segregated or segmented. Like that needs to be clearly defined so that we know where this should exist. And so we can attack that problem quicker.
Regarding the idea of directly passing, I think it's an awesome idea. And also there is another idea that you, for example, if I have internet connection and my friend don't have, but he also has status.
Excuse me for 1 second.
We could use my phone. So it's kind of a mesh network.
Please excuse me for a second. We really want to try and keep away from getting into really deep technical details today. This is a conceptual conversation. That we're trying to get viewpoints about what our current infrastructure is, and less about things that are in the future and that we want to do about it.
Okay. In that case,
that would be really cool.
Without being too technical, we rely too much on our own infrastructure in a lot of different ways. With that being like the cluster that we run, relying on Infura. And so like the way we use the internet and different servers that pass the messages between users is too centralized, which when you have something that's too centralized like that, it's wrought for censorship because that could be stopped. And that's either like the internet itself or infrastructure.
Other problems than the EISP. I'm see what you mean.
Jacek, what do you have to say about this?
I would throw in that these services not a problem on its own, as long as you have the option to use a different one. And it's that option and that possibility that we need to focus on building. Like mesh networks and such are cool, but even in North Korea, you're not going to get the mesh hardware in there, or you can penalize the people for running them or whatever, right? But to the extent that it is possible, the nice thing about these systems is that you keep failures local. Instead of the system going down completely, you still have some sort of working parts. It means that I can communicate with my community, at least, maybe even if I cannot communicate with anyone. And those are interesting strengths, right? But on the other hand, there's also this practical aspect of it that even in Fura and all these other services, they're nodes as well in the system. And if you can use them, why not?
So to what degree do we satisfy that currently if we're looking at our wall of shame?
Not at all.
I think that's the main point that I think what you just said is that we need to provide options. It's not that we can't use these things or shouldn't use these things. It's that we only use these things. We don't provide people options.
Another problem. Infura relies on all this infrastructure. It is up to censorship, like the DNS or something else, servers.
So the question for me becomes: how can we, as in our network, how can we economically incentivize increasing that?
So we could actually try to develop some way that people could use status to buy information from, like you need a ultralight client as is being taught. I think we have a swarm for that, and that would be an option. So if you have these ultralight clients paying and for simply having synced information in sending them, then it's a incentivization for running the full node.
Is that also coercion resistant?
Yeah, because like anyone could do that. You have some technical problems, like you need some way to prove that the answer is correct, and that's something that we should try to fix. Try to maybe some fancy crypto to fix that.
So I'd like to move the conversation on to the app stores. I see that in our wall of shame, somebody's added the release channels being the Play Store and the App Store. What are we doing on that front?
Well, I think Ned had the possibility that, or you have two levels of that, right? One is that you have enthusiasts that can pass either the software or messages to each other, and this is what a mesh network is about, right? That you can pass directly between people. The other thing is that you have people that run it for a pure economic interest. And like that basically means that we pay them to distribute the application, or we pay them to send messages, or we pay them to process our transactions, right? And historically, the enthusiast option has always been there. In communities, you always have people that help others a little bit. But then to get that extra punch and that extra spread and that extra also resilience in a certain way, you set up specialized nodes that do these things. And in the case of Ethereum, you have the miners that do it out of pure self-interest and with an economical incentive on top. In the case of message passing, we want to incentivize people to run these servers, as Ricardo is saying. And in the case of distribution, I imagine that we could distribute it through something like Swarm, for example, where people put up their storage for a profit. They don't really care what's being distributed, and users get access to it that way through a really censorship-resistant network where there are nodes running that don't really care about what's being distributed, but they are offering the service itself.
Right. So, but I think the issue that we're talking about is that the devices that we're delivering status on are the people that are using status on, Android phone and iPhone, that they have to get our application from that store. So, yeah. I mean, aside from jailbreaking, how are we considering approaching delivering features that the app stores don't want to see? There's been discussion about dApps and extensions and whatever. To what degree can we potentially rely on delivering services in that manner inside the framework of our application?
So the Apple doesn't allow the installation of applications outside of the App Store. Is that right?
Correct.
So we have an option to use another company, another Android, for example, that allows it. And as was just said, we can develop some way that the users can give the new versions to another users. I don't know if you know, there is some really old games that are online that the server wouldn't be able to handle the upload to all the users. So what they did was that would be a solution
for Android, but it's not necessarily cognizant of the Apple ecosystem, and people use that system as well.
No, but then there are a few things that you can do there as well, right? So there are like distributions with the enterprise profiles. There are test flight based distributions. There are distributions of.
But don't we have a limitation of 10,000 users on test flight?
No, but I mean, let's say there is a thing that there was this emulator for 16 bits game consoles for iOS, and this was disapproved by Apple, but it was distributed just via GitHub as a side loading, which was, I mean, of course, yeah, you need to have either a technical friend or yourself to have a development environment. But since right now Apple doesn't require you to pay anything to run something on your own phone, then it might work like that. It's not the best solution, but it's an option, right?
I'd add that the future is bright. I mean, right now what's happening in the web world is that WebAssembly is becoming really popular.
Yeah.
What's happening in Ethereum is that libp2p is starting to gain traction as an idea. Taken together, those two things means that from a WebAssembly app, you can basically access a wide array of networks, and one of those networks, if we go with libp2p, which has support for technologies like WebRTC and things that Apple has to support in order to make a useful product. Because like WebRTC is just video calls, right? And we can sneak in our stuff in there as well, right? Just masqueraded as that kind of data.
Yeah. Do you remember that there
on longer horizon? That's right. Yeah.
Do you remember that before the WebSockets there was approach when you create a infinite GIF file and put like information?
Oh wow, that's great! I love that.
So there is always a workaround. I mean, to these kind of things. As long as if we manage to put our application inside a browser completely, then I think it's that you can open on an iOS. Then it's probably would be it.
Well, that can be at least one option, right? It doesn't have to be the only option.
Yeah, of course.
How much time should we spend working on something like this, though? And I feel like as long as we're providing all of the possible ways of getting our app on all of the possible platforms, since we're doing it, because the people who need it will find a way to get it if we have enough options for them to get it. Like if they say for instance they can't get on Apple, they won't use apples. We just make sure that we can provide it to Apple in the ways that they allow it.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We talked a lot about sort of it would be nice if we could talk a bit about social aspects and maybe that level as well, and status as being an agnostic platform? Because I think a lot of great discussion has been on sort of app level and network and distribution and internet so on, but not so much on the social and agnostic aspects. Do people have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it comes to inclusivity as well. As long as, I mean, if we'll be more inclusive in terms of contributing to status, that would help, because then we won't rely on the core contributors that much. But that's another thing that's another task to do, because right now it's like 99.9% of everything is done by core contributors, and if for some reason they wouldn't want to continue working on that.
Why do you think that is? Do you think we're not incentivizing people enough with bounties, or we're not telling them about it more enough? Like the bounty's there, but they don't know about it, or have we just on-ramped all the people that want to contribute?
There are lots of things. I think we still need to give even more focused attempt to make to make our application a little bit more hackable, so to say, it's coming to the yesterday's discussion. I don't want to repeat it completely, that it's hard to build status and it's hard to hack on status for a regular person right now.
We need to make the product
hardly agnostic.
So I guess more sort of social aspects in terms of moderation and these things, because it's definitely a concern, but we want to make sure we don't do it in any kind of central way that enforces censorship, but we still need some kind of tools. So how do we balance that, and how do we provide sort of this sort of building blocks where people can create their own communities without having censorship?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to take an audit and go and visit kind of these other places and see where they start with blocks. You approach it from the ground and see what people what they definitely need and what definitely would work on some of these, older models of phones, or how things work in, without as many colors, or you find that the bone structure of all these elements, and there must be some kind of pattern that would start to emerge in what's necessary, what isn't necessary, what everybody gravitates towards to use to start building, and let that kind of start to inform this kind of language, right? Instead of, it's hard to see it from the top down fully and be like, everybody, you're going to use these tools, whereas you let the people determine kind of what framework they want to work in and do an audit that way. Maybe I think it's more difficult, but in the end, it might give a lot of perspective on, how you begin to reshape and think these elements.
So as a specific example, like we have a Chinese community, and they used to be active on WeChat, and recently they moved over to status, which is amazing. But I don't fully understand the context, but I think some context was that there was a lot of trader talk and so on. And that's maybe not something we want sort of in the default channel, but at the same time, that's definitely something we want people should be able to freely speak about these things. So what does that mean in terms of how we showcase these channels and these types of things? And if you want to have a moderator, how do you make sure it's not a one-time trust decision while still having civil discourse? And how do you deal with that? I think that's an interesting problem that we haven't. There's some sort of ideas and so on, but it's not something we talk a lot about. So we talked a lot about so far.
One thing is also to be humble about our own application. We're bootstrapping this thing, and I think contributors come when the application becomes useful for them, when it actually solves a problem for them and they have an itch to scratch right now. The incentives to work on status is if you can't use it on a daily basis and you can't really use it to solve a problem that you're having. For example, you're a merchant and you have a site and you need to add some particular feature to it. It's hard to come into the project without being an Ethereum enthusiast, right? You'd be doing it for Ethereum right now, and my hope is that we can bootstrap the process in such a way that the app becomes something that people use in their daily lives, or maybe even parts thereof, right? And at that point, that's when contributions start flowing as well.
From earlier conversations, I remember that some developers switched from looking at status to develop something for to using, I don't understand the full context, but using Truffle because at the time there was more documentation for that. So it could also be that we need to basically push Status Studio forward a lot faster because I mean, in a lot of areas, it starts from the developing side, and we may have lost some developers on the way just because of the lack of documentation in the beginning. I think we can offer a lot more now.
I agree with you. Also, we could do some posts explaining how our ENS usernames was built, why it was done like that. So explaining each step of its construction using Embark. So that would be a marketing resource to spread Embark.
So how does this relate to the principle?
Let me try and make the connection.
I mean, it's okay. I just want to make sure we try to stay on track because it's easy to sort of get deep.
No, but isn't it more more contributors like external contributors?
Yeah, this was related to like we are not potentially not censorship resistant because we're not developing in the areas where there might be censorship, and to improve development in those areas, we need to get more contributors outside of the core contributors on board.
Yeah, and I think the way it relates to censorship resistance is if you think about within status itself, one of the largest censorship vectors is in the client side, right? If we only have one implementation of a client, and the reason for that is because it's really sort of like a unique thing that requires specialized knowledge to work on, and it's hard for maybe someone to just fork and build their own version of it. It creates possible censorship vectors on the client side, even if, let's say, at the protocol layer, the data is there, but the client could still censor it. And actually, I don't know if this is on our wall of shame, but this is an example of something that happened. It wasn't malicious; it was with good intentions. But like on the first version of the voting DApp, we accidentally created like the same poll twice, so it just looked bad in the user interface. But we decided on the client side to basically just filter out the first one, which when you think about it is censorship. I mean, it wasn't malicious. It was really just a duplicate entry. But, I guess that's an example of something that could potentially be done in a malicious way going forward.
Can you explain how the filter was created? Like, what were you filtering exactly?
Yeah, so there's polls in like voting. We literally just filtered out one poll that was a duplicate of another poll. Like anyone can create a poll, and you create them in the smart contract. And one of the polls was basically, I guess, created twice. And so the two polls description was nearly identical. And so every poll, when you create a new poll, it's just sequential. There are unique IDs, 1, 2, 3, etc. We knew its unique ID. It was like one of the first polls. So we literally just filtered in the client side. When you fetch the polls, then run this filter out the IDs we don't want to display, and then display the rest of the polls.
Okay. Who has the power to edit that list?
I mean,
of filtered IDs.
Well, on the client, it's done on the client side, not on the smart contract side. So anybody who is basically working on the client can do that, right?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious because like the whole idea in my opinion for censorship is like Google had the whole motto when they started was don't be evil, but that means that they have the power to be evil, and it's more in order to like keep ourselves from being able to be censored, then you want to move towards the motto of can't be evil. And so like you can't be censored if someone can't tell you to do something if you don't have the power to do it. Like we can't give up user data or censor various users if we don't hold their data. It's the same situation. It's like if there is a concentration of power, then that can be manipulated to do some type of censorship. So if we always try and work to not have any power whatsoever, then
100%. And this is sort of the weakness is strength idea as well. That's sort of core of all these protocols. And yeah, I agree. It's a core thing that we have.
But then like isn't moderation is a kind of censorship.
If we get to the idea about actually our legal entity providing an attack vector, I'm curious, how would each of you react if all of a sudden our legal entity got shut down and the ability to get paid in fiat got shut down? How many people here would be willing to take their salaries in their payments in crypto? And how would people actually react if one day Yeshin just popped up and said, guess what, guys? We don't have a company to pay you anymore.
I think we shouldn't even have a legal company, but okay.
I'm of the opposite opinion. I think that I rely on that legal company to pay myself in the United States because it makes things a lot easier for me to not get audited by IRS for unknown stupid reasons. But if it were to shut down, I believe that I'm strong enough an opinion to just get paid in crypto. I'll do what it takes to keep working on this, but I'd rather that not be the case until we have proper regulations in places like the States so that I can manage myself as a good citizen here.
Well, that's the classic manifestation of using a controversial tool in order to reach higher outcome. Just like, I don't know, using Slack in order to build statuses.
Can you expand on that?
Does that mean that people are comfortable with this hybrid existence that it is that we have? In terms of when we're thinking about it in terms of censorship resistance, the threat of violence, essentially.
Well, basically, what you do is that you compromise in the interest of efficiency, right? And as long as it's fine, it's fine. And then what you can do is put in place structures that allow you to keep operating, perhaps less efficiently. When the shit hits the fan, right? And that would be the general approach I'd see it like.
I guess what I'm asking is, are we being honest with ourselves about our reliance on legacy companies? Is that something we need to be more honest about, that we can't function without them? Because we're in a very space.
I think that maybe status should start thinking about opening lots of these legal companies, like status from there, status from here. So just for this, solving this problem of payments and stuff, just to actually do the right thing. Because right now this one entity, legal entity. So if this one is shut down, then everyone will be like have problems. So if we decentralize that as well, having more localized legal companies, then this, of course, maybe is not right now needed because it's not that much contributors, but maybe someday should be interesting to have this. Maybe 3-4 legal companies.
But I mean, isn't everyone who works on the contract has his own or kind of legal entity on his own anyway? So
maybe you can have each one by like if you have a lot of employees in a country, you open something there, like a legal company there, just to pay them.
Just an FYI, we'll talk about.
I'm not sure how this works, but I think it makes sense for me in the idea of decentralization, decentralizing also the legal aspect of it, if we are willing to have one.
So I guess Barry just asked a question in chat. the DAO an extension of our legal entity, or is
guys, we're going to
our
talk
legal
about
entity an extension of the DAO?
we're going to talk about the sort of decentralizing organization and so on tomorrow. So maybe that would be a good opportunity to talk more about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. We should probably table that question for that talk. But in terms of being censorship resistant, in terms of disbursement of payments and just operations, I think if you look at the experiment we're running now with, well, it's not even so much an experiment anymore. We have a mainnet version of our multi-sig wallet, right? There's 7 key holders. Every single person is a citizen of a different country, distributed. I think we're distributed among like 4 continents. So I think that's pretty, and it requires multiple signatures to execute a transaction. So even if, I mean, it would really take, I think, coordination between multiple states simultaneously to do take some kind of attack, or some kind of coordinated effort between multiple parties across multiple countries to have some kind of coercive attack on that multi-sig wallet.
Okay, that's good in terms of the company, but if somebody, what are we going to do if somebody turns off our cluster? What's our plan?
Everyone gets their laptop out and leaves it on during the night, access boot nodes and mail servers. We have some instructions. Yeah, no, of course. It's not the long-term kind of thing, but yeah.
Would that currently work? Like we could run mail servers locally?
It would be extremely hacky, but one idea is that if sort of this would happen, that would force us to do it. But in terms of doing it with high availability and so on, that would be more challenging, absolutely. That's also what Adam and so on people are working on, and we have instructions up for this and getting DApp node up soon, and then also desktop. So I think we're fairly close to at least having an emergency plan, even if it's not as amazing as it is right now.
Yeah, I was about to say that desktop should by default be a potential boot node and mail server, because most desktop have enough capacity to do that. So it's only if you're on laptop that you can configure it to be a light node.
Yeah, except you can be a boot node if you don't allow active connections to your machine, which is blocked on a vast majority of routers for vast majority of ISPs. So you still need something in the cloud, or kind of in the cloud, or you need a better provider.
If that's our threat model, why are we not preparing for it now that we're all doing that to the degree that we can and not relying on our cluster?
But we are working on it right now, right?
Okay, I would say that, like, since I know that we're working on it, and we're working on it hard, but in the same spirit, sorry dogs, in the same spirit that we left Slack and we're leaving Slack, we should probably, once we have the option and a clear guide to run mail servers on our own, we should kill the cluster as fast as possible. And so that way, even if the experience may be a bit lacking, it will force us to make it better as fast as possible. In the same way, desktop is getting better and better and better very quickly. If once we have a good route of getting, like, MVP out and allow people to run these things, we should make sure we get rid of that central point of failure, because I think that's the most glaringly obvious one.
Well, yeah, we should do it like the clusters. Like the clusters are a node, and then they just can be shut down.
Guys, I think let's take a break, 10-minute break or so, and then we can move on with the security one. We can definitely keep this conversation going, and it can fork in lots of directions. We still have the HackMD where you can add stuff, and I guess if people want to start on this sort of security world stream, we can do that as well as a kind of inbox. Otherwise, let's start again in 12 minutes. Does that sound good to people?
Sounds good to me. I think that we made a lot of progress.
I agree.
In a bit.